Comcast vowing to spend $100 million over the next 3 years in order to help fight racism and injustice.
Today, I'm proud to announce Apple's Racial Equity and Justice Initiative with a $100 million commitment.
Walmart and the Walmart Foundation are committing $100 million to create a new center on racial equity.
The NBA Foundation, which will donate more than $300 million to Black social and economic causes.
Nike revealing that Michael Jordan and the Jordan brand will be donating $100 million to organizations dedicated to ensuring racial equality.
Greetings and welcome to the Wharton School Beyond Business. Our session today is about race and corporate power, where we will explore the financial, operational, and strategic commitments firms have made to combat systemic racism challenging the Black community. Beyond Business is an ongoing conversation that explores the complex and pressing issues impacting individuals and organizations across the world. Our first three-part series shines a light on how systemic racism impacts business and society and ways it can be confronted. Beyond Business is part of the Tarnopol Lecture Series, which is named for Mickey Tarnopol, a Wharton graduate from the class of 1958, and his wife, Lynn. Mr. Tarnopol was a global business leader and served as vice chairman of the International Banking Division of Bears and Stearns, and he was an active member of the Penn and Wharton community. I am thrilled to be joined on this virtual stage by my new and old friends. Please join me in welcoming Carla Harris, Vice Chair and Managing Director at Morgan Stanley, Wes Moore, CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, Delilah Wilson Scott, Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for the Comcast Corporation, and my University of Pennsylvania colleague, Kat Rosqueta, also a Wharton graduate from the class of 2001. She's founding executive director of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. We will be welcoming questions throughout this session, so we invite you, as you hear things that are meaningful and impactful to you, to submit your questions through the chat feature. Kat will organize the Q&A discussion later in the program. I'd like to begin, Carla, actually, with a question for you first. You began your career at Morgan Stanley 33 years ago as an investment banker. How would you say that the industry has evolved over the years in terms of its attention and focus on matters of diversity? And how has your own role and relationship to Morgan Stanley changed across that time period?
Well, first of all, Dean James, thank you so much for having me as a part of this conversation, this important conversation. And I am really honored to be here with both Wes and Delilah and you. So let's talk about how diversity has changed on the street, and let's talk about how it's changed at Morgan Stanley. I will tell you, when I started in 1987, it really wasn't a conversation, or frankly, a word that you heard a lot on the street. And it certainly wasn't a word I heard a lot during the walls. But it was around 1990 that I would argue that corporate America, and around 91, 92, where Wall Street started to have the conversation and the word diversity was used. That was the first time you started to see diversity training. That was the first time people started thinking about programs to enhance diversity and having partnerships and collaborations with some of the historically Black colleges, for example, and other institutions where they could actually source a great pipeline. But I would argue that back in the early 90s, for corporate America and for Wall Street, frankly, people thought about diversity as the right thing to do or the moral thing to do. And people really didn't think about it from a commercial aspect. I would say fast forward now 30 plus years, people are starting to really think that it is a part of the strategy. It is a part of being able to innovate. It is a part of any organization's future. But we're at the early days of people really starting to embrace that you got to think about diversity, inclusion, and equity as a necessity in the strategy and a necessity for you to win in whatever industry that you're in. And with respect to my relationship, I have been involved with diversity at the first awakening, if you will. I was on the ground floor when we created the Richard B. Fisher Scholars Program, along with 2 other women of color, as we actually put pen to paper to create that program, which was our first program to 5 historically Black colleges. And I have been involved, whether it's been recruiting or mentoring or sponsoring, and certainly using my voice on behalf of diversity and inclusion for the last 30 years, and have been a part of how the firm has evolved even in the last 8 months around significant programs with respect to scholarships at historically Black colleges, enhancing our pipeline programs, certainly supporting Black banks, doing what we have been able to do with the Multicultural Innovation Lab, with our podcast, elevating the discussion about the inequity of the distribution of capital to women and multicultural entrepreneurs. So I am happy to say that I've been a part of the conversation and the evolution over the last 30 years.
I can certainly testify to that as someone who has watched your career over at least the past 20. Every year, there's more and more and more that you're doing, not only with Morgan Stanley, but as you say, on the street. So we thank you for that effort. Wes, your life has been chronicled in your book, The Other Wes Moore, which is how I came to know you initially. You're an Army veteran, and today we thank you and celebrate you for your service on the eve of Veterans Day. You joined Robin Hood in 2017. What was it about the mission of that organization that compelled you to want to do the work of Robin Hood? And how has your positioning and thinking about this work for Robin Hood changed in light of the last several months?
Well, first, Dean James, it is an honor to be with you, and thank you for this invitation. And to have a chance to be on this panel with people who I don't just respect and admire, some of the best business leaders around, but also, truthfully, just being on here with women of color who are leading in such a powerful way. This means the world to me. And I can personally attest to what Carla was saying, because she was one of the first conversations that I had when I first entered into Wall Street. And so even though it wasn't at Morgan Stanley, she was as supportive as if I was. So I can attest to everything that she was talking about how she has the receipts to show that mentorship matters. And it's interesting because when I was first approached by Robin Hood, my first gut reaction actually was no, and it actually didn't have anything to do with Robin Hood per se. It had to do with philanthropy, where I had, in fact, I remember having this conversation with the person who was the board chair, and I said, I've been publicly skeptical of philanthropy, and his response was, he's like, yeah, we've done our diligence and we've seen it because it's all over the internet, and I was like, so I'm not sure why I was the person you approached about this. And I think part of the reason is because I have seen that philanthropy has had an amazing impact on lives and communities. And I've also seen philanthropy for philanthropists. I've also seen philanthropy where this is just simply about how can we make philanthropists feel better? Where this is not, and I had, no interest in, one thing we always say with our work is, we don't do charity. I don't believe in charity. I believe in change. And if you can then take private and philanthropic capital to drive change, then that's different. And one of the things that always intrigued me about Robin Hood was, not only firstly, that I have without even realizing it, a very personal connection was, one of the first neighborhoods that Robin Hood invested in was one of the neighborhoods that I grew up in. And I didn't know that full circle until I actually came and learned more about the history of the organization. I learned more about the hundreds of community partners that Robin Hood has on the ground, and I also learned more about the importance of the usage of data in terms of making the investments. And part of the thing that I wanted to do, and also I think about some of the teammates and team members that we have on board, some of whom who are very proud Wharton grads, to include Derek Ferguson, our COO, was if you follow the data, then let's go where the data takes us. And the data shows us that, a college degree increases lifetime earnings by nearly $1 million. But we also know that the research and the data shows us that a Black college graduate on average earns less than a white high school dropout. Data, right? That a Black child born to parents in the top income quintile is as likely to fall into the bottom income quartile in adulthood as they are to stay in the top quintile. And that's compared to white children who are nearly 5 times as likely to remain in the top quartile. Data. And so I find that where we are right now organizationally and where the field is right now is, if we're going to be honest about this moment, we have to be honest about the data. And the idea that we somehow, or any of us somehow, can be colorblind organizations, it doesn't make sense, because we do not live in a colorblind society, nor are the structures that have been built up colorblind. And so part of, I think, our responsibility in this moment is to be as aggressive in both understanding and dismantling as we historically have been in building and perpetrating that and hardening that. And so that's where I feel like this time and this moment actually allows us to do everything that we have been doing, but except we're doing it better because it's coming in with a greater sense of honesty about where the data continues to lead us, and then why we have to take that information and be as aggressive in terms of our response as we have been before in hoping for a frame that frankly wasn't there in the first place.
Well, powerful words, and you're right, the data speak for themselves in many respects. Delilah, you joined Comcast in 2016, where you are currently leading the Philanthropic and Economic Opportunity Initiatives. I'm sorry, where in 2016 you were with JP Morgan, but since joining Comcast, you have been in a remarkable position to have two perspectives. One is as Chief Diversity Officer, but also as head of the organization's philanthropy unit, the foundation. How has your career prepared you for this moment, and how do you see the intersection between the philanthropic opportunities and diversity in the context of Comcast?
Well, first, let me say thank you for having me here. It's a definite honor to be here with you. Welcome again to Philadelphia, and so excited for your appointment as dean. Been, watching Wes and Carla for some time, but actually quite fortunate now in that I'm working with them quite intentionally right here at Comcast. Carla Harris sits on our external Joint Diversity Council, which definitely holds us accountable in many ways, and we're supporting Wes through the Robin Hood Foundation, and through their work on data and metrics, we think it's one of the keys to fighting poverty right here in Philadelphia in our headquarters city. So this is an excellent group to be a part of on any day of the week. But to your question, I think for Fortune 50 companies, what's always been true is that leadership is critical. So I've been fortunate to work with, two of the best leaders in the business, leadership of Jamie Dimon as CEO of JP Morgan, and absolutely when you think of Brian Roberts, you think of integrity, you think of how he's been able to weather through many storms and many waves as head of Comcast Corporation, and most importantly, the leadership he's showing today and our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think leadership is absolutely critical. The other thing that I'll say is, when you're at the helm of a Fortune 50 company, it can be overwhelming to think about the assets that any of us have access to. The incredible talent, right, inside of our company, the access to talent we have. When I think about the reach, the global reach of our company and the brands we have here at the Comcast Corporation, Xfinity, NBC, our news platform, Universal, and Sky, people forget how many people we're touching and influencing through our media, through our technology, and through our approach every single day. It's hard to believe. That said, regardless of any Fortune 50 company, we know that none of us can do it alone, and especially in moments of crisis like we're in now, we need to be thoughtful about public-private partnership. We need to be thoughtful about even bringing our other private sector colleagues around the table to understand what we can do and how we should be doing it differently. But again, just to follow up on Wes's point, philanthropy is just one piece of the puzzle. It's an incredible tool, incredible risk capital, if you will. But when we think about our employment channel, our supply chain, our investment in businesses, there are so many ways that Fortune 50 companies can stand up in this moment. And I think that's important to note. But we can never forget that it really takes a true partnership cross-sector for us to move forward.
Thank you for sharing that. And Delilah, since you already have the floor, I'll start with you on this next question. And that is, companies, as you very well know, are committing unprecedented amounts of support to fighting racial injustice. Why is that happening now?
I think in these days, when any crisis hits, and you think about the advent of social media, employees, customers, and audiences are looking for companies and leaders to respond with a sense of urgency, and like never before. And so many people are certainly compelled to move, and often philanthropy is sort of the quickest tool to point to. I think it's symbolic to some. I think it's a voice and a signal for leadership and companies to say that they acknowledge this moment. But I think this moment, 2020, is very different for those of us who've been working in this space for decades. It's a different moment for all of us. And I think in looking at this commitment, companies really need to think about really stepping back and evaluating all of their practices, their policies, their philanthropy, their investments in community, because clearly if we were all doing our best, we wouldn't be here today. There was something that was so powerful about the shared experience of witnessing George Floyd's murder and being in this moment of COVID, where we have this, health crisis, economic crisis at the same time in the midst of a racial reckoning. Companies knew that we could do better. Despite, having longstanding records in diversity and inclusion, we now brought different conversations into the workplace. So employees are sharing stories of microaggressions and outright racism and how that's impacted their work life in a way that probably wasn't discussed as open before. So the onus and accountability is on companies to step up in this moment. And that's both inside of our walls as well as in extending some of that to our communities.
Thank you. Wes, you mentioned earlier about this notion of philanthropy for philanthropists. And when you said that initially, I was thinking about the individual philanthropist. But companies, as you know, have foundations and are also philanthropic. So is this moment, from your perspective, a symbolic moment for companies to feel better about themselves? Or is there real sustained change here that you are imagining might be coming from this time?
It's a really good question, and I think the honest answer is we don't know yet.
Yeah.
Because I think we've watched a significant amount of capital being put into these issues. I mean, over $6 billion that have been put into issues of racial and social justice. But I think the thing that I have noticed, though, is that it's about much more than just the philanthropic or the capital contribution that corporations have made. I think we've watched a movement where people understand that there's a measure of shared complicity that we all have earned in this moment. And so since there's a measure of shared complicity, there actually has to be a measure of shared action. That none of us can just stand around and wait for somebody else to move on this. None of us can just wait around and say, well, the government needs to do X, or community organization needs to do Y, or the police department needs to do Z. I think what people are understanding is that whether we're looking at these, twin crises, I think Delilah laid it out beautifully, where you're looking at these crises that have hit us, whether it be the introduction of a virus that has had absolutely catastrophic, impacts, both health and economic impacts, or whether it was watching Mr. George Floyd's name being added to a much longer lineage of people who have had interactions, Black people of color who have had interactions with police, whether you're talking about the names of Michael Brown or Philando Castile or Tamir Rice or Walter Scott or Eric Gardner or Sandra Bland or Breonna Taylor or Freddie Gray, that the list goes on, that I think people are realizing that talking about COVID-19 is not just simply about a vaccine, and nor is talking about what happened to Mr. George Floyd simply about the banning of chokeholds, but that we're dealing with a much larger issue of race that everybody has a responsibility to be able to own, and everybody has a responsibility of being able to address. And so I think we're watching corporations that really are leading, in many cases, in pretty heroic and unprecedented ways, of being able to say, this is not just simply about increasing our CSR commitment, nor is it simply about making our Instagram page Black. This is about being able to look at the real roots and how do we use every single lever at our disposal in corporate America and philanthropy to be able to say, how do we address the issues of employment? How do we address issues of equity and fairness? How do we address the Black wealth gap that we have in this country, a 10-to-1 wealth gap? And it's not because one family worked 10 times harder. And so all these are things that I think we've actually watched the corporate side and our corporate partners show real leadership. And I think but the idea that is this going to be sustained, there's a hopefulness that I know I have now that truthfully I don't know that I've always had. So this moment is leaving me tentatively inspired by the things that we're seeing.
Tentatively inspired. I'll take that. Carla, even as companies are pledging their support to the Black community, they're still struggling in many cases with allegations of discrimination or challenges with achieving justice and equity within their own firms. I know that Morgan Stanley recently had some allegations and we're facing some of those issues. Is it possible for organizations to reconcile this disconnect between wanting to do the right thing and still struggling with how to do the right thing?
Yeah, I tell you, I think that the struggle is, as we come into this moment, as both Delilah and Wes have alluded to, there was no organization that was perfect. And I would argue there was no organization that had even matured, frankly, around the diversity and equity and inclusion conversation. So therefore, you're already vulnerable to things that you did in the past and things that you might be doing right now. It doesn't change the fact that this is a moment in time that I think has served as a powerful motivator or instigator to advance whatever it is you had been doing before. And as I listened to both of them, I was sitting here thinking to myself that the reason, in my opinion, that this moment is so different than others, because it's not like the whole world and it's not like this country hadn't witnessed every single one that Wes referred to. But I think there's two things that's making this different. I think the millennials and the Zers are one of the primary reasons that this moment is different, because they have said no mas. They are looking at people in positions of power, many of whom are running corporate America, that are their parents, who are looking at them and they're saying, really? You guys had 50 years to get this right? And we're still dealing with this? How can that be? And all you have to do is look at who has been in the streets as your evidence. Not that boomers and Xers have not been, but who has really, for well over 100 days, been the ones that have been keeping this conversation alive. And I do think, to agree with Delilah, the second thing that's made this moment different is it used to be the case that companies had three constituents: the shareholders, the employees, and the customers. And each of these constituents had a powerful tool. Your shareholders, they could sell your stock. Your employees could quit. And your customers could vote with their feet and not buy your products or your services. But now there's a fourth constituent called community. And it too has a powerful tool, and it is called social media. And within seconds, you can have massive brand degradation. Within seconds, you could lose billions of dollars of market cap. And because we have technology, it is now inescapable. A lot of the things that we have seen over the last 5 years, Dean James, as you know, have been happening for decades. But we didn't always see it unless it made the national news, because let's face it, that was the power behind the civil rights movement in the 60s. People were horrified to see people getting gunned down or mowed down with water hoses or with dogs, right? And now it's on everybody's phone in seconds. And I think that is what has made this moment so powerful. And it's the millennials and the Zers that companies desire to attract and retain. And they care a lot about the jersey that they're wearing. And if the jersey and the people that they're going to affiliate with do not line up to their values, they won't come. And it now puts in jeopardy any company's objective to be the employer of choice in their industry.
As someone who is the parent of two Gen Zers and spends her life in higher education, I'm constantly surrounded by those young people, and I couldn't agree with you more. They are walking with their feet, and they're saying that this matters to us, and we are making choices about the kind of organizations we want to be affiliated with. And I think companies that were the go-to brands 10, 15 years ago are struggling to identify the talent or to keep and attract the talent that they want now because there's a misalignment between what those companies stand for, that's a perception, and what the young people today are really asking for in terms of a set of values and responsibilities. So
Yes, ma'am.
young people are changing the conversation for sure. Wes, back to you. What are the systemic poverty issues that Robinhood seeks to rectify as it relates to race?
And even before, I want to just say a very quick amen to what Carla has said. And because you watch how so many of these big movements that have shifted and changed, it's been because corporations have actually helped to push them, right? If you can't understand the ending of apartheid without understanding the role that corporations had in actually the ending of that. I was thinking about as you were speaking, Carla, about the fact that that Washington had now no longer yet has a mascot for its football team, and activists have been crying for the change of that for a very long time. But when corporations said, you know what, we're not comfortable with having our name on your stadium, we're not comfortable with advertising with you anymore until you get rid of that mascot. That's when the mascot was lifted, and so it's a perfect example of that role. And I think about this idea, and it actually goes back to your question, Dean James, about systemic poverty. In many ways, all poverty is systemic poverty, because the reason that we have all of that in many cases is because of systemic breakdowns, and particularly because the damage and the cruelty of poverty is not even just that it's there, is that oftentimes poverty is it's sticky, it's predictable, it's generational. Oftentimes, the fact that in New York City alone, that half of the city lived in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years before COVID-19. Not half of a borough, not half of a group. Half of the city lived in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. And so we think about the partnerships that we have, even with folks here on the Zoom with Comcast. The work that's being done with everything from how we're thinking about our relief work to how we're aligning work with a new platform we built called the Power Fund, which is focused exclusively on supporting entrepreneurs of color, despite the fact that we've watched a 400% increase in philanthropy over a 2-decade period. Only 10% of all philanthropic dollars go to organizations led by people of color. And so this initiative is exclusively focused on how are we supporting organizations led by people of color. I think about the work that we have and are working on with Morgan Stanley, about how are we thinking about ways of supporting street vendors. I mean, these are individuals, families, communities that have been hit hardest by this. And so I think part of our responsibility is to understand that everything that we all do when it comes to addressing poverty, it's addressing systemic poverty. It's addressing the fact that philanthropy alone is not going to fill those holes unless part of our goal is also about changing the systems that are creating so many holes that people are falling through. There's a quote that actually sits on my desk from Dr. King, and it says, "Philanthropy is commendable, but the philanthropists can never forget the economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary." And that's really what we're trying to battle. It's the economic injustice that allows systemic poverty to put so many people in the position and in the condition that poverty is a far too frequent reality in the lives that they're living.
Such powerful insights. Delilah, let me just say to the audience, I want to continue to encourage you to submit your questions via chat. We're going to be going to the audience Q&A in just a few minutes. So please, if you haven't already, feel free to submit your questions. Delilah, as Chief Diversity Officer, you have a strong vantage point for what the climate is like among employees at this moment in time when there's such a focus on racial injustice. I know that I started as Dean of the Wharton School in July, which was at the height of the unrest, if you will. And one of the first things that I felt I needed to do was understand the experiences of the Black staff and students and faculty at the Wharton School at this moment when there was such heartache, if you will. So I'm curious, what have you seen either within Comcast among the employees, or what is your sense about how people at other companies are feeling and doing, and what's going through their minds with respect to racial injustice as it relates to their own work environment?
I mean, I think and all of us have referred to it in many ways. I mean, we didn't just arrive on this moment, right? We're talking about centuries of injustices, and many Blacks in corporate America have to live in a duality to be successful. So in this moment in 2020, that duality was challenged, and people had to bring, a different face to work, and were asked different questions. So I do think in the very early days, our managers, our leaders wanted to lean in and provide those safe spaces for conversation, and heard some shocking and surprising things, heard some things experiences that they shared in this moment. Some were new, some were all too unfortunately common. But it was an opportunity for people to get to know each other in a different way, differently than the workplace has traditionally allowed for. So I do think those safe listening sessions and conversations need to continue to happen. This is we can't think of this as a moment that will pass. We have to think of this as a moment and a challenge for us to do things differently. And so employees are feeling that. Just not too long ago, we had our first company-wide Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Day, and that brought together 50,000 employees and counting into a shared experience. They heard from our CEO. We had Jerry Kong in to talk about implicit bias, and he did it in a way that brought science and real life situations. So regardless of the perspective that you were bringing to the table, you could be a little bit more respectful about other perspectives and how it impacts our work product. It's not just about being nice to the people that you work with, but many of these issues are impacting our ability to be successful as a company, beyond just being decent colleagues. So our employees were certainly seeing that. When Brian, our CEO, sent out his letter, it was in early June at that time, for our $100 million commitment, he spoke in that letter about how this impacted him. And I think it was helpful for people to hear from their colleagues, from our leadership, about what this moment meant and why things had to be different. I think it's also, all of us are thinking about, it can't be, when we get to another year and a couple years, and the further we're away from that George Floyd moment, which is the first moment, unfortunately, for some having to have some of these conversations. We don't want that urgency, that momentum on how we continue to keep the focus on diversity and equity to die. We've all seen it happen before. There is as much hope as there is in the environment. There is a healthy sense of skepticism. And so we're hearing that from employees. We're trying to obviously demonstrate our commitment extends beyond any one letter, any one announcement. We're fortunate to have a $100 million commitment on the table. But I think what's most important is it's not just about that dollar amount or these 3 years. That commitment is sort of like a catalyst and license for our company to be transformed in this moment. And we need whatever we invest in to last beyond that 3 years. And I think that involves thinking about where we bring business expertise to the table. It's why a lot of our focus is on digital equity in particular, but also, having to make some tough calls and being accountable for our own results. Where have we seen progress? Where do we need to double down? But I do think it's been a different environment for our employees. And even just in this election year, the conversations people are having in the workplace and what that means around race. We've never had as many conversations. There have been safe conversations in ERG setting and employee resource group setting, but these are conversations across different cultures and ethnicities and races, and I think that's been important.
So you spoke to Comcast's $100 million commitment around racial justice. And my question is actually for all of you. And Carla, I'll start with you, since before we went on air, we were talking about leaders and leadership. What kind of leadership is necessary when a company makes that kind of commitment especially publicly, what are the leadership skills, traits, competencies, you name it, that are necessary to know how to deploy those kinds of assets in a way to really have the impact that you all have been talking about?
Yes, absolutely. I think you need to be an intentional leader. And I think as a part of being an intentional leader, you have to be authentic. Because you obviously have to be able to deliver the narrative around your why and your how, especially when you're deploying these kinds of assets. I think you need to be transparent about what you know and what you don't know. And when you know it, I think you need to be visible, especially in this COVID-19 experience, the shelter-in-place protocol that we all have. You have to be aggressive about using digital mediums because this is a substitute for the stability that people are used to. I do think you have to be intentional about voice. One of the things that we talked about before we went on air is that there are a number of companies that have never talked about how they really felt and what their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion and now belonging was all about, except other than to say that it was something that they were, quote, committed to. But nobody ever asked the second or third order derivative question, what does that mean? How do you define your commitment? So they never had to say. And I've had many leaders across all industries ask me over the last 7.5, 8 months, why do I need to say something? We're not comfortable doing that. We don't do that. And I said, the problem is we're in an environment now where your silence can be misconstrued. And you don't want your silence misconstrued for lack of interest or lack of commitment. Now is the time, to actually express the courage. And as you know, Dean James, I give this talk around intentional leadership that has 8 pearls associated with it of authenticity and creating clarity, creating other leaders, diversity, innovation, and so on. And one of the things I say, the very last pearl is voice. You have to be willing to call a thing, especially when the thing is bad. Because that's the thing that underscores your authenticity. That's the thing that creates the kind of relationships that you want with your people and the kind of relationships that you want to have with your clients. But the strand that holds all of those pearls of intentional leadership together is courage. Because it takes courage to call a thing. Who hasn't been in a room where something should have been said around diversity and inclusion or around a diverse candidate and we all looked at our shoes? It takes courage to create clarity when you can't see. It takes courage to be doggedly committed to diversity as a leader when we all are competing in very dynamic, competitive environments. We all reach for the familiar because we're all vulnerable to unconscious bias. I don't care who you are or how smart you are. So you have to be intentional to push against that. It takes courage to focus on innovation. It takes courage to engage enough with people to truly be inclusive. And it takes courage to create clarity when you can't see. So it's really that kind of courage and commitment that are hallmarks, in my opinion, of leadership, especially in turbulent times. You can't lead if people will not follow. And if you're not authentic or transparent, and certainly empathetic in this COVID environment, people will not follow you. You will not be an effective leader.
Courage, authenticity, intentionality, I think those are such important skills regardless of whether you're giving away hundreds of millions of dollars or not. That is the essence of how to be effective and influence and have the kind of influence that you as an individual and the company that you represent and advocate for can make a difference. Wes, with the Robin Hood Foundation, what counsel do you have for companies on how to have the greatest impact with their philanthropic dollars?
I would say there's 3 main things that we would focus on and counsel corporate partners and just partners as a whole. One is it's the need to and it's the importance to be deliberate about cross-sectoral partnerships. That whether you are in philanthropy or whether you're in the corporate side, whether you are an institution of higher education, that the real impact is going to happen when you're able to work in a cross-sectoral fashion. Because we have to understand the unique roles that we play, the unique lanes that we can run down, and being able to move with a sense of collaboration is actually the fastest and the most effective way of actually being able to create the kind of change that you're looking for. I'd say the second piece is you have to make sure that the impacted population is part of the conversation and not just subjects of the conversation. Where I feel like that's something that a lot of people miss when it comes to both their philanthropy and the way they're thinking about their businesses is that if you're not having a genuine conversation that includes impacted populations, your altruism will be viewed as something else. And it will be viewed very quickly as something else. And so one of the best ways to not just make sure that you're actually accomplishing what it is you're trying to accomplish, we believe in this idea that, people who are closest to the challenge are also going to be the ones who are closest to the solutions. And so you have to be able to hear the ideas and the thoughts from impacted populations. Also, frankly, it's the best way to guide to be able to guard your blind spots. Certain comments that people make or organizations make in an idea that it is a progressive statement. If you have the right people around you, you might change the way you make a statement. You might change the way you think about things, but you might not have had the right people around you when you were going through that decision-making processes. And then the third piece I would say to our partners is understand the uniqueness of your voice is going to be about much more than just how you're thinking about your philanthropy. That sometimes the most powerful and effective things that you can do is actually being able to look at your internal practices. And that in many ways is some of the biggest statements that you're going to make. How are you thinking about things like giving employees a voice? How are you thinking about things like committing to lobbying for good? Like how we're thinking about criminal justice reform? How are we doing things like committing to a living wage and parental leave and sick leave and healthcare coverage? How are you thinking about things like who are you using as your vendors, as your suppliers, as your accounting firms, as your law firms? How are you thinking about coming up with ways of showing not just in word, but also in deed that you care about measures of equity and inclusion? Because in that frame, I can tell you, you will make a bigger statement to a larger population than any press release that you can put out or frankly, even how you're even thinking about ways that CSR can be more all-encompassing.
Again, such powerful insights. We oftentimes think of philanthropy as the dollars that we spend towards a certain issue or initiative. Yet there's so many other things and ways that companies can have impact. And Carla, I want to have my last question be to you before we turn it over to Q&A with the audience. Tell me more about what Morgan Stanley is doing with respect to the multicultural lab initiative that you have started and has been so wildly successful. How is that seen as a way of contributing to some of the challenges and issues around racial justice?
Yes, absolutely. It is one of the sources of my pride and joy. I will tell you that the Multicultural Innovation Lab was born 4 years ago, and it really was born to try to close the gap in the inequity of distribution of capital to women and multicultural entrepreneurs. Because as you know, women get less than 4% of all VC dollars, and people of color get less than 2%, depending on your source. Some sources say 1%. And this doesn't make any sense. I mean, that is a gross inequity in the marketplace. And whenever you have that kind of market inefficiency, as I like to say, there's a huge commercial opportunity. And most investors like to go where other people aren't because they think they're going to get an outsized return. Well, interestingly enough, that definition still does hold in this case because these entrepreneurs are resilient. To Wes's point, we have found that those who have been in the middle of the problem have the best solutions, the most sustainable solutions, the most competitive solutions. And that's certainly what we have seen with these entrepreneurs. So we created the lab, and it is an in-house accelerator like any market accelerator that you know. And we give these entrepreneurs three things. We give them cash in exchange for a single-digit percentage of the company like any other accelerator in the market. We give them 6 months of content that is specifically designed to help them to evolve from being a founder to a CEO, because you know there is a difference. And we also give them connections to some of our largest investment banking clients to advance the scale of their growth. And I will tell you that most VC stats, to use Wes and talking about the data with venture capitalists will tell you that 1 out of 10 work. Well, we've had a far different statistic. We've had 5 for 5 in our first class. In our next class, we probably had one that, looks like it's on a stretcher now. In the third class, maybe one that may not make it out of COVID. But in the fourth class, all of the companies are thriving. So when you have 1 out of 9 or 10, that doesn't work versus the industry average where only 1 out of 10 does work, that tells you something. Yes, you can argue that we can pick them, but my point is it's not a scale, it's not a supply issue. These companies are out there, and not only are we operating the lab, but what we're also doing is elevating the stories around the inequity of the distribution of capital and how entrepreneurs have been successful in accessing that capital through the podcast. And with the podcast, what we're trying to do is to put a playbook out there. So if you're an entrepreneur, then maybe you want to listen to, a Rich Dennis talk about how he raised money, with Sundial, or maybe you want to talk about Doug Song and how he sold his business for a few $1 billion to Cisco. Or if you are happen to be a city treasurer or someone that runs the economic development business in your city, you might want to listen to Kevin Warren talk about how he created a very effective public-private partnership to get $1 billion stadium built in Minnesota that then generated $3 billion of capital in that same geographic area. So that's part of what we're trying to do to close this inequity of the distribution and to eradicate the I can't find any, or I'm not sure how we can get this done.
Appreciate that. Now we'll continue our conversation, and I'd like to turn it over to my colleague from the University of Pennsylvania, Kat Rosqueta, who will share with us some of the questions that have come in from the audience. Kat?
Happy to, and no surprise, this conversation has generated a lot of questions. So I'm going to bucket them into some themes. And the first is around something that I know Carla just spoke about, and I'd love to hear Delilah's take, given her role as Chief Diversity Officer at Comcast. And this is, what do you make of the statement, "We hire the best people," in light of racial biases in hiring? And are there ways, this is from Cheryl LaMonica, a follow-up to that, are there ways to think of hiring minority professionals into top jobs on the potential of the candidate and not just ticking off the boxes on a job description? So I'll invite Delilah to respond, but of course, welcome all of you to chime in too. Delilah?
And I think all employers are looking for better ways to assess skills. And while many people have focused on different types of AI technology, we know biases there as well. And so oftentimes, especially in many of the careers we've talked about today, it's degrees and access and networks that have been more of a factor determining successful hires as opposed to someone's actual skill sets. In fact, the Philadelphia Fed just did a study recently about looking, if you strip away some of the context and looking at core skills, there's more transferability, more occupational mobility than maybe we previously thought in terms of how we currently hire. I still think we have a lot of work to do to get it right, quite frankly. It's easier to do in some areas than not. But even that notion of, the right, we hire the best talent, it often, people think of the statements of, oh, that person doesn't necessarily, is not a right fit for our culture. Well, what exactly does that mean? Because a lot of that language can signal bias. And so I still think there's, again, a tremendous amount of opportunity in that space. I think we're all trying to get smarter about how we look at core skills being the determining factor more so than networks and degrees.
Terrific. Anything folks want to add? Yeah, go ahead, Wes, please.
I think there's something that actually our current board chair often says, and there's a line that he says where he says, you find what you're looking for, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that, even when it comes to this conversation about where's the talent, and we can't find talent, and I just find it interesting that then we can look at a trading floor, and why is it that 30% of the trading floor played lacrosse? Right? I mean, it's not that lacrosse players are more talented than anybody else. It's just you find oftentimes what your network is, and you find what you're looking for. And I remember just hearing a glaring example of this, where Akiva Katz, and it's a public example, so I'm not giving any names, but who's from Bow Street, and Chris Lee, who's a KKR partner. They went to not Wharton, but they went to another graduate school of business together. right? And then Kiva was putting together a slate for an activist campaign for Matt Calley and asked Chris for some suggestions of some highly qualified candidates. And Chris knew a woman named Tammy Jones, who was an African-American CEO, was one of the names suggested. Tammy then went through the process. Tammy then joins the board of CLI, which is a $1.5 billion REIT. They would not have known Tammy Jones had it not been for Chris Lee. So you find what you're looking for. And if that means being able to expand your network, if that means being able to tap into and reach out to people who might have a more expansive network than what you have, that is the solution to be able to address this issue. It's not that there is a lack of talent out there, and there is no data that reinforces that statement. It is about how can we go out there and be deliberate about what it is you're looking to find, and then know we're willing to tap the networks to be able to go and actually find what you're looking for.
Well, you're taking us into a next bucket of questions that came through, and it's about there's a lot of questions about data analytics and artificial intelligence, and one is from Pamela Michelle Jasper. What are any of your plans to bring awareness and address the bias that is built into a lot of the algorithms that all companies are using now? And Delilah touched on it a little bit, but bias in data, bias in algorithms. How do we deal with that?
Well, I'll start.
Getting all the nods about, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yes, Carla, please.
No, and I think one of the ways that you deal with it is to continue to talk about it and elevate the conversation. That's number one, is to make people aware of the fact that, it's sort of what you put in is what you're going to get out in terms of, the evaluative report card that you use. That's number one. Number two, the other way we can get at it is to make sure that more people of color get involved in that side of the equation. That we can get more people exposed to what data science is all about, data analytics is all about, and actually try to, push kids and great candidates into those directions, because the next, not this one, not what has been created now, because that is what it is, but the 2.0 or the 3.0 of the data analytics that we're using and the AI that we're using, that is touched by a more diverse group of people. That is the other way that we can come at it. But we have to keep talking about it now, or we will become a victim to it. And this cohort of people that are going in will be disadvantaged.
I swear, Carla and I did not talk about this beforehand, but Penn happens to have the first certificate program in data analytics for social policy. So yes, preparing the next generation of data analysts. And
I think it's
yeah, please, Wes.
I'm sorry, I should say, and I think it's true to understand too that it's not like data isn't biased now, right? So it's not like the idea of bias, not the idea that we're concerned about data. We should have always been concerned about data being biased, because at some point when bias has been created, when data is being analyzed, data is just exclusively about what inputs are you doing or are you taking in order to process your outputs. Right? That's all data is. And so there's always been a slant and a bias when it comes to data. And I think Carla's absolutely right. It's just as we think about a perfecting of data, it's not just that AI and the future of work becomes something that we have to contend with. We have to contend with things that we've been dealing with for generations beforehand. And then there has to be this constant push for a bettering of data and a bettering of the analytics to be more human.
But the issue now, Wes, I would argue, is that because technology is involved, we can convince ourselves of some magic objectivity, right? And that's why I said we have to elevate the conversation so that people understand just because you have technology involved, that doesn't clean, as you point out, the data now, because it's about how you have put together the algorithms, who have put together the algorithms that's now reading it. That's what we can't allow that to get off the hook, if you will.
Interesting. I think people would be surprised by the amount of decisions and technology that they experience every day that's determined by an algorithm. This is happening now, and sometimes it feels like a convenience. And I just think we have to be prepared to educate ourselves and challenge.
Great. Well, like I said, we got so many questions. I attempted to bucket them. I also want to be very respectful of people's time. So thank you for those responses. And I'm going to turn it back to Dean James to bring us home.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kat. And I just want to take a minute to thank my old and new friends for joining me today. This has been a tremendous conversation, and, it has a theme, but I think the conversation was so rich that we traveled in a number of different directions, all of which were relevant and all of which we hope are informative and constructive to the real work that we have ahead as a society to help unite the country and find ways to bring racial equity within the sphere of influence that we control. So Carla, Delilah, Wes, Kat, thank you again for your time. And for those of you who are watching, thank you for spending an hour with us. The next Beyond Business event is called Race and the Selling of America, which will take place in the first week of December, so stay tuned for more details on that. That topic will explore how industries are reconciling their complicated history with marketing brands through Black culture, and why now is the time in particular for Black influencers to use their voice to incite meaningful change. So until then, thank you all and good evening.